The rain had not stopped for 3 hours, and Alastair Ravensworth had not planned to return to Ravensworth Hall that night or any night soon. Yet here he was, soaked through his coat, standing before the tall iron gates of the estate he had avoided for nearly 6 years. He had told his driver to wait at the crossroads. Something had pulled him back, a letter from his late father's solicitor, vague and urgent, mentioning a locked wing of the house that no one was permitted to enter. Alastair did not like mysteries. He liked them even less when they belonged to his own family. He pushed open the side door with the old brass key his father had given him as a boy, back when the house still felt like a home and not a monument to silence. The hallway smelled of dust and candle wax. A single lamp burned at the far end, though no one should have been awake at this hour. He followed it, his boots echoing against the stone floor, past portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow him with quiet disapproval. At the end of the east corridor stood a door he did not remember. It was narrow, painted the same gray as the wall around it, almost hidden unless one knew to look. A brass lock gleamed dully in the lamplight, newer than anything else in the house. Alastair frowned. He tried the handle, locked. He knocked once, twice, and heard nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat. Then faintly a voice, a woman's voice, low and careful, asking who was there. He answered with his name, and for a long moment there was silence on the other side. When the door finally opened, it was only a crack, and a pair of pale eyes studied him through the gap before the door widened enough to let him see her fully. She was younger than he expected, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and a plain gray dress that looked as though it had been mended many times. She stood with the wary posture of someone who had learned to expect trouble from every direction. Behind her, the room was small but tidy, lit by 2 candles, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and shelves of books that looked well read. "Who are you?" Alastair asked, though his tone was gentler than he intended. "And why are you locked away in my own house?" "I am not locked away," she said quickly, though her eyes flicked to the door as if to check it was still open. "I live here. I have always lived here." "That is not an answer." She hesitated, and in that hesitation Alastair saw something he recognized from his own childhood, the particular caution of someone who had been taught that certain truths were dangerous to speak aloud. He softened his voice further. "My name is Alastair Ravensworth. This is my family's estate. I have been away for years, but I did not know anyone lived in this part of the house. Please tell me your name." "Elinor," she said finally. "Elinor Hale." The name meant nothing to him, and yet something in the way she said it, quiet and careful, as though testing whether it was safe to claim it at all, told him this was only the smallest piece of a much larger story. He stepped further into the room, taking in the details, the small collection of dried flowers on the windowsill, a child's drawing pinned to the wall, faded with age, and a portrait hand-drawn of a woman who resembled Elinor closely enough to be her mother. "How long have you lived here, Elinor?" "As long as I can remember." "And who takes care of you?" "Mrs. Fenwick brings meals. Mr. Grayson manages everything else. They said your father arranged it before he passed." Alastair felt something cold settle in his chest. His father had died 4 years ago, and Alastair had spent most of that time abroad, first out of grief, then out of habit, avoiding the estate and the memories it held. He had assumed the house sat quiet and unused except for a skeleton staff. He had never imagined a young woman had been living within its walls the entire time, hidden so carefully that even the family solicitor had only hinted at her existence in careful, guarded language. "Why would my father hide you here?" he asked, though he suspected she did not know the full answer any more than he did. "He said it was for my safety," Elinor said. "He said there were people who wished harm on my family, and that as long as I stayed here quietly and no one knew my name, I would be protected. Mrs. Fenwick has always told me the same thing. I am not to leave the house. I am not to be seen by visitors. I am not to write letters that might be read by the wrong hands." "For how many years has this been your entire life?" She looked away, and Alastair understood the answer without her needing to say it. Her entire life. Not months, not a passing arrangement, but years spent in careful concealment, raised behind a locked door in a wing of a house that even its own family had forgotten existed. Anger rose in him, quick and sharp, though it was not directed at her. He thought of his father, a man he had respected and in some ways feared, a man who had always spoken of duty and honor as though they were the highest virtues a person could hold. What kind of duty required hiding a young woman away from the world for the whole of her life? What kind of honor kept a secret buried so deep that even his own son had never heard a whisper of it? "Does anyone else know you are here?" he asked. "Anyone beyond this house?" "A few," Elinor said. "Mrs. Fenwick, Mr. Grayson, a physician who visits twice a year, though I have never learned his name. I do not know who else. I have never been permitted to ask." Alastair looked around the small room again, at the neat rows of books, the careful arrangement of a life lived entirely within four walls, and something in him hardened into resolve. Whatever secret his father had carried to his grave, whatever danger he believed justified locking a young woman away from the world, Alastair would not continue it, not for another single day. "Pack whatever you wish to bring," he said. "I am taking you home with me." Elinor's eyes widened, and for a moment fear flickered across her face, quick and unmistakable. "You cannot. Mrs. Fenwick will not allow it. She says it is too dangerous." "I am the Duke of this house now," Alastair said, and though he rarely used his title to assert authority, he used it now deliberately so there would be no mistaking his intention. "Whatever arrangement my father made, I am ending it tonight. You are not a prisoner. You will not spend another year hidden behind a locked door because of a promise you never agreed to." "You do not understand what you are risking," Elinor said, her voice trembling slightly, though whether from fear or something closer to hope, Alastair could not tell. "Then you will explain it to me on the way," he said, "but you are not staying here another night." He expected relief. Instead, Elinor's expression shifted into something more complicated, gratitude tangled with dread, as though she wanted desperately to believe him and yet could not quite allow herself to. She glanced once more at the door, as if expecting Mrs. Fenwick to appear at any moment and forbid the entire idea, and then slowly she began gathering a small bundle of belongings, the drawing from the wall, the portrait of her mother, a worn leather journal she kept beneath her pillow. As they made their way back through the darkened corridors of Ravensworth Hall, a shape moved at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the low light. Mrs. Fenwick stood there, her face pale, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. "Your Grace," she said, her voice tight with alarm, "you must not do this. You do not know what you are unleashing." "Then tell me," Alastair said, stopping before her, Elinor close beside him. "Tell me exactly what danger required hiding a young woman away for the whole of her life, and I will decide for myself whether your warning has merit." Mrs. Fenwick's mouth opened, then closed again, and in her eyes Alastair saw genuine fear, not for herself but for Elinor. It was enough to tell him that whatever secret lay behind this arrangement was real and dangerous and far from finished, but it was not enough to make him change his mind. "I will hear the whole story," he said, "but not tonight and not from someone too frightened to speak it plainly. Elinor is coming with me." He did not wait for her answer. He took Elinor's small bundle of belongings in one hand and offered her his other arm, and together they walked out of the house that had been her entire world, into a night full of rain and uncertainty, toward a future neither of them could yet fully imagine, and toward a truth that would soon prove far more dangerous and far more surprising than either of them expected. Behind them, Mrs. Fenwick remained standing in the corridor long after the sound of the carriage wheels had faded into the storm, her hand pressed to her chest, whispering a name under her breath, a name that belonged not to Elinor, but to someone else entirely, someone whose shadow had not yet fallen across this story, though it soon would, and when it did, nothing about the quiet, hidden life Elinor had known would ever be the same again. The carriage rattled along the muddy road, rain drumming steadily on the roof, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Elinor sat with her small bundle clutched against her chest, staring out at the darkness as though she expected the house to reach out and pull her back at any moment. Alastair watched her carefully, uncertain how to begin a conversation with someone who had spent her entire life, believing that silence was the only thing keeping her safe. "You do not have to tell me everything tonight," he said finally. "But I would like to understand, even a little, what you have been told about why you were hidden." Alina turned to him, and in the dim light of the carriage lamp, her face looked older than her years, weighted with a kind of caution that no young woman should have needed to carry. "Mrs. Fenwick always said my mother had enemies. Powerful ones. She said if certain people learned I existed, they would come for me, and there would be nothing anyone could do to stop them. She said your father made a promise to my mother before she died, that he would keep me safe, hidden, until it was no longer dangerous for the truth to be known. Do you know who these enemies were?" "No, I was never told a name. Only that I should never speak of my mother to anyone outside the house, never write letters, never allow my likeness to be drawn or painted, never leave the grounds. I broke that last rule only once when I was perhaps 12. I walked to the edge of the orchard because I wanted to see how far the sky stretched beyond the garden wall. Mrs. Fenwick found me and wept, actually wept, and told me I had nearly ended everything. I never tried again." Alastair felt a fresh wave of anger at his father, tempered now by a growing unease. Whatever secret lay behind Alina's confinement, it had clearly frightened the household enough that even a 12-year-old girl walking to an orchard had provoked genuine terror. That was not the behavior of people protecting against an imagined threat. That was the behavior of people who believed, with total conviction, that real danger existed. "What do you remember of your mother?" he asked, gentler now. Alina's fingers traced the edge of the small portrait she had brought with her, the hand-drawn image of a woman with dark hair and a serious, kind face. "Very little. I was young when she died. I remember her voice more than her face, singing to me at night. I remember she used to say that one day, when it was safe, she would tell me everything, who my father was, why we lived so carefully, why she watched the road so often as though waiting for someone to arrive. But that day never came. She died when I was 6. After that it was only Mrs. Fenwick, and later, occasionally, your father, though he visited rarely and always seemed troubled when he did." "Troubled how?" "He would sit with me sometimes and ask if I was well cared for, if I had everything I needed. Once, I asked him directly why I could not leave the house, and he looked at me with such sadness that I never asked again. He said only that the world was not yet safe for me, and that he hoped, before he died, to make it so. I do not think he managed it." The carriage jolted over a rough patch of road, and Alina gripped the seat to steady herself. Alastair reached out instinctively to help, and for a moment their hands touched, and neither pulled away immediately. "I intend to find out the truth," Alastair said. "Whatever my father was protecting you from, I will learn what it is, and I will make certain it can no longer touch you. You have spent enough of your life hiding." "You say that as though it will be simple," Alina said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only weary honesty. "But you do not know what you are facing. Mrs. Fenwick's fear tonight was not the fear of a woman who exaggerates. I have known her my whole life. I have never seen her that frightened, not even when I nearly ran off toward the orchard." Alastair considered this in silence. He had grown up in a world of titles and inheritances, of old grudges between noble families that occasionally surfaced at social gatherings in the form of cold civility and pointed remarks. But he had never imagined that such grudges could result in something serious enough to require hiding a child away for the whole of her life. And yet here was the proof of it, sitting across from him in a carriage in the middle of a storm, a young woman who had never been permitted to see the world beyond a garden wall. They reached the crossroads where Alastair's own driver waited with the second carriage, and as they transferred their few belongings, Alastair noticed a rider in the distance, motionless at the edge of the trees, watching. He could not make out a face in the darkness and the rain, but something about the stillness of the figure unsettled him. He said nothing to Alina, not wanting to alarm her further, but he instructed his driver to take the longer route into town, avoiding the main road. "Is something wrong?" Alina asked, noticing the change in his expression. "Nothing I cannot manage," Alastair said. though his eyes lingered a moment longer on the empty road behind them before he climbed into the carriage beside her. They rode through the night largely in silence, the storm gradually easing as they moved further from Ravensworth Hall, until at last the dark shapes of rooftops and chimneys began to rise against the horizon, marking the outskirts of town. Elinor pressed her face gently against the window, watching the passing houses with an expression of quiet wonder that made Alastair's chest tighten. This ordinary sight, streets and shop fronts and the glow of lamplight in windows, was entirely new to her, a piece of the world she had been denied for reasons neither of them yet understood. "It is larger than I imagined," she said softly. "You will have time to see all of it," Alastair said. "As much as you wish." They arrived at Alastair's townhouse just before dawn, a tall, elegant building with dark shutters and a small garden at the front, far more modest than Ravensworth Hall but comfortable, and above all, safe, or so Alastair hoped. His housekeeper there, a practical woman named Mrs. Boyle, met them at the door with evident surprise but asked no questions, quickly arranging a room for Elinor and bringing warm tea to ease the chill of the journey. Elinor stood in the doorway of the small guest room, looking at the simple but comfortable furnishings, the window overlooking the garden, the freedom implied by an unlocked door, and something in her posture seemed to loosen, just slightly, as though a weight she had carried for years had shifted, even if it had not yet been lifted entirely. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for tonight. I do not yet know if I believe things will truly be different, but I am grateful you brought me here." "Get some rest," Alastair said. "Tomorrow I intend to send word to my solicitor and begin searching through my father's papers. If there is a reason you were hidden, I will find it recorded somewhere. Families like mine rarely leave anything entirely unwritten, even the things they wish to bury." Elinor nodded, though her eyes carried a flicker of apprehension. "And if what you find is worse than either of us expects?" "Then we will face it together," Alastair said, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. "You are not alone in this any longer." He left her to rest and made his way to his study, though sleep felt impossible after the events of the night. He poured himself a small measure of brandy and sat by the cold fireplace, turning over everything Elinor had told him. A mother who had died young, watching the road as though expecting danger. A father who had made a promise and kept it faithfully, even at the cost of a child's entire childhood. A household staff frightened enough to weep over a 12-year-old's walk to an orchard. And now, a rider in the darkness, watching the crossroads as though waiting for exactly this kind of departure. Whatever secret his father had carried, it was not finished. It had only been waiting, patient and silent, for the locked door to finally open. The next morning, Alastair rose early and made his way to the small, locked cabinet in his father's old study, the one place in the townhouse where the late Duke had kept his most private correspondence. He had never had reason to open it before, respecting his father's privacy even in death, but circumstances had changed everything. He found the key among a ring his father's solicitor had delivered years ago, tried several before one finally turned in the lock, and opened the cabinet to find neat stacks of letters, tied with ribbon, organized by year. He began reading, and within the first hour, his understanding of his own family's history began to unravel and reform into something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. There were letters from a woman named Margaret Hale, written in careful, elegant handwriting, spanning several years before Elinor's birth. There were replies drafted but never sent, his father's handwriting cramped with what looked like anxiety. And there were other letters, colder, more formal, bearing a seal Alastair did not immediately recognize, a stylized falcon that seemed to belong to another noble house entirely. He was still reading when Mrs. Boyle knocked softly at the door to inform him that Elinor had woken and was asking for him. He gathered a handful of the letters, uncertain yet how much to share, and made his way toward the small sitting room where she waited, the weight of what he had begun to uncover settling heavily in his chest. Whatever answers lay ahead, he sensed they would not come easily, and that the danger Mrs. Fenwick had warned of the night before was closer, and more real, than either of them had yet allowed themselves to believe. Eleanor sat by the window when he entered, a cup of tea untouched on the small table beside her, her eyes fixed on the garden outside as though she still could not quite believe she was permitted to look at it without fear. She turned when she heard him, and her gaze immediately went to the letters in his hand. "You found something," she said. It was not a question. "A great deal," Alastair admitted, setting the letters down carefully on the table between them. "Letters from a woman named Margaret Hale, written to my father years before you were born. I believe she was your mother." Eleanor's breath caught. She reached for the top letter with careful, almost reverent hands, tracing the elegant handwriting before she began to read. Alastair watched her face shift through a dozen emotions: disbelief, grief, and something that looked almost like recognition, as though some part of her had always known there was more to her mother's story than silence and a locked door. "She writes to him as though they were dear friends," Eleanor said softly, "perhaps more than friends." "There are other letters," Alastair said, "colder ones from another family entirely. I have not finished reading them, but there is a seal I do not recognize, a falcon, repeated across several of the later letters. I intend to ask my solicitor if he knows the house it belongs to." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the front door, unusually early for visitors. Alastair heard Mrs. Boyle's footsteps in the hall, followed by a brief exchange of voices, one of them unfamiliar and insistent. He rose and stepped into the hallway just as Mrs. Boyle appeared, her expression tight with concern. "Your Grace, there is a man at the door asking for the young lady staying with you. He says he comes on behalf of a Lord Ashworth, and that the matter is urgent." Alastair felt a cold jolt at the name. He had seen it, just moments ago, at the bottom of one of the colder letters in his father's cabinet. He instructed Mrs. Boyle to tell the visitor that no such lady resided in the house, and to send him away, but as he returned to the sitting room, he found Eleanor standing near the window, her face pale. "I heard," she said, "Ashworth. I do not know the name, but Mrs. Fenwick once said it in her sleep, years ago, when she had a fever. She said it as though it frightened her even in dreams." "You should stay away from the windows for now," Alastair said, drawing the curtain gently closed. "I do not yet know how they learned you were here, but I intend to find out." They did not have long to wait for an answer. Within the hour, Alastair's solicitor, a sharp and careful man named Edward Linwood, arrived at the townhouse, summoned by an urgent message Alastair had sent at dawn. Edward had served the Ravensworth family for over a decade and knew more of its private affairs than almost anyone outside the family itself. When Alastair showed him the letters and explained the events of the previous night, Edward's expression grew grave. "The Ashworth family," Edward said slowly, settling into a chair, "has long been known for its pride, and for a grievance that has never fully healed. Years ago, before you were born, there was a dispute between your grandfather and the elder Lord Ashworth over a parcel of land, and if the old rumors are to be believed, over a woman as well. The dispute ended badly. There were accusations of fraud on both sides, a duel that was narrowly prevented by intervention from the Crown, and a rift between the two families that has never closed." "What does any of that have to do with Eleanor?" Alastair asked. Edward glanced at the letters spread across the table, then at Eleanor herself, who sat listening with quiet, careful attention. "If Margaret Hale was connected to the Ashworth family in some way, perhaps through blood or marriage, and if she later formed a close bond with your father, that alone might have been seen as a betrayal significant enough to reignite old hostilities. And if there is a child born of that bond, a child who might carry some claim, whether to land, to a name, or simply to knowledge the Ashworth family would prefer remain buried, then I imagine they would consider her presence a considerable threat to their standing." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap, a threat for simply existing. "Old families guard their reputations fiercely," Edward said, not unkindly. "Sometimes more fiercely than they guard anything else. I do not yet know the full truth of what happened between your parents, Miss Hale, but I intend to help uncover it, carefully and quietly, so that whatever claims or secrets are involved, We understand them before the Ashworth family forces the matter into the open on their own terms. Alastair studied the letters again, searching for any further clue. Near the bottom of the stack, he found one final letter, dated only weeks before Aliner's mother had died, written not in Margaret's hand but in his father's own careful script, a draft that appeared never to have been sent. It spoke of a promise made, of a document entrusted to his care, of a truth that, if revealed too soon, would place a child in grave danger, and a vow to protect that child until the danger had passed or until she was old enough to decide for herself how the truth should be used. "A document," Alastair said aloud. "My father mentions a document entrusted to his care, something Margaret gave him before she died." "Do you know what it might be?" Edward asked. Alastair shook his head slowly, but Aliner, who had been quiet for several minutes, suddenly straightened in her chair. "The journal," she said. "The one I brought with me last night. It belonged to my mother. I have never read it fully, only glanced through a few pages when I was younger, and most of it seemed to be simple thoughts, nothing of importance. But perhaps I did not understand what I was reading." She retrieved the small leather journal from her room and set it carefully on the table. Alastair opened it with careful hands, turning through pages filled with Margaret Hale's neat handwriting, recording small daily observations, the weather, small joys, quiet moments with her infant daughter. But near the middle of the journal, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, more guarded, filled with references to a growing unease, mentions of men watching the house, of letters intercepted, of a fear that someone intended to challenge a claim she had never fully explained. One entry, dated only a month before her death, caught Alastair's attention entirely. "If anything should happen to me," Margaret had written, "Reginald has promised to protect her, and to keep safe the proof of what was done to my family all those years ago. It is hidden where only he and I know, and I trust him with my whole heart to use it only if her safety requires it. She must never learn how dangerous the truth can be until she is strong enough to carry it." Alastair looked up from the journal to find Aliner watching him, her eyes bright with a mixture of grief and determination he had not seen in her before. Whatever fear had kept her silent and hidden for years seemed, in this moment, to be giving way to something new, a fierce and quiet resolve to finally understand the truth of her own life. "There is proof somewhere," she said. "Proof of something done to my mother's family, something the Ashworths do not want uncovered." "Then we find it," Alastair said, "before Lord Ashworth or his men find you first." Edward Linwood rose from his chair, gathering the letters carefully. "I will make inquiries into the old dispute between the families, and into any documents that might have been filed with the courts at the time. In the meantime, Your Grace, I would advise moving Miss Hale to a location Ashworth's men do not yet know, at least until we understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. It is clear they already know she left Ravensworth Hall. It will not take them long to learn where she has gone." Alastair nodded, already turning over the possibilities in his mind. His townhouse, though comfortable, was known to many in society, and it would not be difficult for someone determined enough to learn its address. He thought of his cousin, Charlotte, who lived quietly on the edge of town in a modest house that drew little attention, and who had always been fiercely loyal to their family despite the distance she kept from society's more prominent circles. "I know somewhere," he said. "My cousin Charlotte will take her in without question, and she is careful, discreet. It will buy us time." Aliner looked between the two men, and though fear still lingered in her eyes, there was something steadier beneath it now, a quiet strength that had perhaps always been present, simply waiting for the chance to be seen. "I do not wish to hide again," she said. "Not the way I hid before. But if it is only for a short while so that we might learn the truth and end this properly, I will do what is necessary." "It will not be forever," Alastair promised. "I intend to see this resolved, and I intend for you to live the rest of your life exactly as you choose, without fear of locked doors or hidden wings or men waiting at crossroads in the rain." They made arrangements quickly. By early afternoon, Aliner was settled in a quiet room at Charlotte's house, introduced only as a distant family friend recovering from a long illness. an explanation vague enough to discourage curious questions from the household staff. Charlotte, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s with a dry sense of humor and an unshakable loyalty to her cousin, asked no further questions once Alastair explained, in careful terms, that Aline's safety depended on discretion. "You always did have a talent for finding trouble the moment you returned to that house," Charlotte said, though her tone carried more affection than criticism. "Very well, she will be safe here, but you had better resolve this quickly, Alastair. I do not enjoy keeping secrets from my own neighbors." "I intend to," Alastair said, "as quickly as the truth allows itself to be found." That evening, as he returned to his own townhouse, he found a folded note waiting on his desk, delivered, according to Mrs. Boyle, by an unknown messenger who had not waited for a reply. He opened it carefully and felt a chill settle over him as he read the single line written inside, in a hand he did not recognize but a tone that left no doubt about its intent. "Return what belongs to the Ashworth name, or the girl will learn exactly why she was hidden, in the worst possible way." Alastair stared at the note for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of his desk, his resolve hardening into something colder and more determined. Whatever proof his father had hidden, whatever truth Margaret Hale had died trying to protect, it was clear now that the Ashworth family believed it still existed, and that they were prepared to act quickly to recover it, or to silence anyone who stood in their way. The quiet, hidden life Aline had known was over. What lay ahead now was a race to uncover a truth buried for over 20 years, before the family that had once tried to erase it entirely could finish what they had started so long ago. Alastair did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after Mrs. Boyle had retired, the note from Ashworth's messenger spread before him alongside his father's letters and Margaret Hale's journal, searching for any thread that might lead him toward the hidden proof his father had once promised to protect. He read the journal twice more, cover to cover, and on his third pass he noticed something he had missed before, a small pressed flower tucked between 2 pages near the back, and beside it, in Margaret's handwriting, a single phrase that seemed out of place among her ordinary entries. It read simply, "Where the falcons first quarreled." He did not understand the meaning at first, but the word falcon caught his attention immediately, recalling the strange seal stamped across the colder letters from the Ashworth family. He brought the phrase to Edward Linwood the following morning, who studied it for a long while before his expression brightened with recognition. "There is an old boundary marker," Edward said, "on the disputed parcel of land your grandfather and the elder Lord Ashworth once quarreled over. It has stood there for generations, carved with a falcon on one side and a hawk on the other, representing the 2 families. Locally, people have always called it the Falcon Stone. If Margaret hid something there, or made reference to it, it would make a certain kind of sense. It was, after all, the very place where the original dispute between the families began." "Then that is where we must look," Alastair said. But before any journey to the boundary stone could be arranged, word arrived that Charlotte's household had received an unexpected visitor the previous evening, a well-dressed gentleman who introduced himself politely at the door and asked, with careful phrasing, whether the lady of the house had recently taken in any new guests. Charlotte, sharp as ever, had given nothing away, claiming no such guest existed, but the visitor's card, left behind out of what seemed a deliberate show of confidence, bore a name that confirmed their worst suspicion. Lord Callan Ashworth. Alastair rode immediately to Charlotte's house, where he found Aline pale but composed, sitting near the fire with Charlotte close beside her, a small pistol resting, unused but visible, on the table nearby, a clear sign of how seriously Charlotte had taken the encounter. "He was polite," Charlotte said, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. "Too polite, the kind of politeness that carries a threat beneath every word. He said he hoped whoever might be staying with me was comfortable, and that he would hate for anyone under my roof to come to harm through simple misunderstanding. Then he left his card and walked away as though he had done nothing more than pay a friendly call." "He knows she is here," Alastair said grimly. "He suspects," Charlotte corrected. There is a difference, and it may buy us a little time, but not much. You need to resolve this quickly, Alistair, before suspicion becomes certainty. Alina rose from her chair, her hands steady despite the fear still visible in her eyes. Then let us go to this Falcon Stone, whatever it is, and find whatever my mother hid there. I am tired of waiting for danger to arrive. I would rather walk toward the truth myself. Alistair hesitated. The boundary stone lay on the very parcel of land that had first sparked the feud between the two families, close to Ashworth territory, and the risk of encountering Lord Callan's men there was considerable. But he understood, too, that hiding Alina away indefinitely would accomplish nothing except repeating the very pattern that had already stolen so many years of her life. "We will go carefully," he said finally, "at first light before anyone expects us to move." They departed before dawn the next morning. Alistair, Alina, and a trusted groundskeeper named Henry, who had served the Ravensworth family for decades, and whose quiet loyalty Alistair trusted completely. The ride to the boundary land took the better part of 2 hours, along quiet country roads that grew increasingly unfamiliar to Alina, who had never in her life traveled so far from either Ravensworth Hall or the narrow streets of town. The Falcon Stone stood at the edge of a wide, overgrown field, a weathered gray marker taller than a man, carved on one side with the proud, sharp lines of a falcon, and on the other with a hawk mid-flight, its wings spread as though caught forever in the moment before a strike. Ivy had crept up much of its base, and the field around it lay quiet and untended, the kind of forgotten place that seemed to exist outside the ordinary flow of time. Where would she have hidden something here? Alina asked, running her fingers gently over the carved falcon. Henry, who had grown up on land not far from this very boundary, suggested they examine the base of the stone itself, noting an old local custom among boundary markers of this type to sometimes conceal a small hollow beneath, meant originally for storing land deeds or dispute records between neighboring estates. They worked carefully, clearing away the ivy and packed earth at the base, and after nearly half an hour of careful digging, Henry's hand struck something solid, a small iron box, rusted but intact, buried just beneath the surface. Alistair lifted it free and set it on a flat stone nearby, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the old, corroded latch. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect it from the damp, lay a bundle of documents, yellowed with age but legible, along with a small velvet pouch that, when opened, revealed a single ring, its band engraved with the same falcon crest, though set with a stone of deep, unusual blue. Alina unfolded the topmost document with careful hands, and as she read, her expression shifted slowly from confusion to something closer to disbelief. "This is a deed," she said. "A land deed naming my mother's family as the rightful owners of this very parcel, the land the Falcon Stone stands upon. And here beneath it, a second document, a confession, signed by someone named Ashworth, admitting the land was taken through a forged agreement decades ago." Alistair took the papers from her carefully, scanning the signatures, the dates, the careful legal language that, even after all these years, still carried unmistakable weight. "This is what they have been searching for," he said slowly. "Proof that the Ashworth family's claim to this land, and perhaps to a great deal more, was built on fraud. If this were made public, it would not simply embarrass them. It could unravel decades of inherited wealth and standing built upon a lie." "And the ring," Alina said, lifting it gently from its pouch. "I do not know its significance yet," Alistair admitted. "But I intend to find out." They had barely finished securing the documents back inside the iron box when Henry, who had remained watchful at the edge of the field, called out a low warning. Riders were approaching from the direction of Ashworth Land, 3 of them, moving at a steady, deliberate pace that left no doubt they had come looking for exactly this. Alistair quickly wrapped the box in his own coat, helping Alina onto her horse with hurried but careful hands. "We cannot outrun them across open field," Henry said grimly. "But there is a narrow path through the trees to the east, one Lord Ashworth's men are unlikely to know as well as I do. It will be a hard ride, but it should bring us out closer to the main road." They rode hard through the trees as the riders behind them closed the distance, shouts carrying faintly through the woods, though Alistair kept his focus fixed entirely on the narrow, uneven path ahead and on Aliner's steady, determined presence beside him. Branches whipped past them, the ground uneven and treacherous in the low morning light, but Henry's knowledge of the land proved sound, and after nearly 20 tense minutes, they emerged from the trees onto the main road, considerably ahead of their pursuers, who had clearly lost the narrower trail in the dense woods behind them. They did not slow their pace until the outskirts of town came into view, and even then, Alistair kept a careful watch behind them the entire remaining distance. When they finally arrived back at his townhouse, breathless and travel-worn but safe, he set the iron box down upon his desk with a profound sense of relief mixed with grim determination. "We have the proof," he said. "Now we must decide how best to use it in a way that protects you fully, Aliner, rather than simply provoking Lord Ashworth into more desperate action." Aliner stood beside the desk, still catching her breath from the ride, her eyes fixed on the documents that held the truth of her mother's family and of her own long-hidden identity. "I do not wish for revenge," she said quietly. "I only wish to no longer be hidden, to live without fear that a locked door is the only thing standing between me and danger. If this proof can accomplish that, then I am ready to see it used, however difficult the path ahead may be." Alistair looked at her, struck once again by the quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of confinement without ever fully breaking her spirit. "Then we will find the right path together," he said. "And I promise you, whatever comes next, you will face it as a free woman, not a hidden one." Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade, and somewhere across the city, Alistair knew Lord Callan Ashworth would soon learn that his men had failed, and that the proof he had spent so long trying to recover, or perhaps to destroy, was now firmly out of his reach. The next move would belong to him, and Alistair intended to be ready for whatever form it took. Edward Linwood arrived at the townhouse within the hour, summoned by an urgent message, and examined the documents from the iron box with the careful, methodical attention of a man who understood exactly how much weight such papers could carry in the right or wrong hands. He read the confession twice, his expression growing more serious with each line. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "A signed confession of fraud, tied directly to a land dispute that has shaped the standing of two noble families for generations. If this were presented properly, before the right authorities, it would not simply return this parcel of land to its rightful line. It could call into question every subsequent transaction the Ashworth family built upon that original, fraudulent claim. Their entire fortune, Your Grace, may rest upon a foundation far less solid than they have led society to believe." "Then why would my father never use it?" Alistair asked. "If he had this proof for years, why keep it buried beneath a stone rather than exposing the truth outright?" Edward considered the question carefully before answering. "I imagine, Your Grace, that your father understood exposing this truth would not simply embarrass Lord Ashworth's family. It would very likely provoke exactly the kind of desperate, dangerous response we have already begun to witness. A family facing the complete collapse of their fortune and reputation has little left to lose, and men with little left to lose are often the most dangerous of all. I suspect your father judged that protecting Aliner quietly, rather than exposing the Ashworth family publicly, was the safer path, at least until she was old enough, and the political climate favorable enough, to see the matter resolved without placing her directly in harm's way." Aliner, who had been listening quietly from a chair near the window, spoke up. "But that safety came at the cost of my entire childhood. I do not fault my mother, or even your father entirely, for the choice they made. But I do not intend to spend the rest of my life protected in the same way, hidden behind locked doors while others decide what is safest for me." "I do not intend to hide you again," Alistair said firmly, "but Edward is right to caution us. If we simply hand this confession to the courts without careful preparation, Lord Ashworth may act before the law can offer you any real protection. We must move deliberately." Edward nodded in agreement. I would suggest, Your Grace, that before any public action is taken, we gather additional support, allies within the court and society who would recognize the significance of this discovery and stand behind its authenticity. A single document, however damning, can be dismissed as forgery by a family with enough remaining influence to sow doubt. But if presented alongside credible witnesses and independent verification, it becomes far more difficult to challenge. What sort of witnesses? Alastair asked. The physician who visited Alinar twice a year at Ravensworth Hall, for one, Edward said. If he can confirm the arrangement your father made and the reasons given for it, his testimony would carry weight. Likewise, Mrs. Fenwick, if she can be persuaded to speak plainly rather than out of fear, could confirm the details of Alinar's confinement and the promises made to protect her. And there may be other victims of the original land fraud, families who lost holdings under similarly questionable circumstances during the same period, whose testimony would demonstrate a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Alastair turned this over carefully. Returning to Ravensworth Hall meant confronting Mrs. Fenwick directly, something he had avoided since the night he first found Alinar, uncertain how much the housekeeper truly knew, or how deeply her fear of the Ashworth family ran. But if her testimony could help secure Alinar's safety permanently, it was a conversation he could no longer postpone. I will return to the hall, he said, and speak with Mrs. Fenwick myself. Perhaps, freed from the immediate danger of Alinar's presence there, she will be willing to explain what she truly knows. I want to come with you, Alinar said immediately. Alastair hesitated. It may not be safe. Ashworth's men were watching the estate before, and they may still be. I have spent my entire life being kept away from danger by people who believed they knew best, Alinar said, her voice steady but firm. I understand the risk. I am asking to face it anyway, because it is my life and my mother's memory that we are trying to protect. I do not wish to remain behind while others decide my fate for me, not again. Alastair studied her for a long moment, recognizing in her expression the same quiet determination he had first sensed the night he found her locked away in that narrow room. He thought of his father's final letter, the one urging protection until she was old enough, strong enough, to decide for herself how the truth should be used. Looking at her now, he understood that moment had clearly arrived. Very well, he said. We go together, but we take precautions and Henry rides with us again. They departed for Ravensworth Hall 2 days later, having spent the intervening time carefully planning their approach with Edward's guidance, arranging for a small, trusted escort, and ensuring word of their journey remained as quiet as possible. The estate looked much the same as it had the night Alastair first arrived in the storm, though in daylight it seemed smaller somehow, less imposing, stripped of the mystery that had once surrounded its locked wing. Mrs. Fenwick met them at the door, her face draining of color the moment she saw Alinar standing beside the Duke, alive and well, and clearly no longer confined behind any locked door. Your Grace, she said, her voice unsteady, I feared the worst when I heard nothing after that night. We need to speak with you, Alastair said. Plainly and honestly about everything you know regarding Alinar's mother and the arrangement my father made to protect her. Mrs. Fenwick's eyes moved between Alastair and Alinar, and something in her expression softened, years of carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. I have kept this secret for so long, she said quietly, that I sometimes forget there was ever a time before it. Please, come inside. I will tell you everything I know, though I fear it may not be as much as you hope. They sat together in the same small sitting room where, years earlier, Alinar's mother had once brought her infant daughter to meet the housekeeper for the first time, according to Mrs. Fenwick's careful, halting account. She explained how the late Duke had approached her personally, not long after Margaret Hale's death, entrusting her with Alinar's care and swearing her to absolute secrecy, explaining only that dangerous men sought the child, men connected to a powerful family whose name he refused to speak aloud even in private conversation, for fear the walls themselves might carry word of it back to Ashworth ears. He told me, Mrs. Fenwick said, that if anyone ever came asking after a child matching Alinar's description, I was to deny all knowledge, absolutely, without hesitation, no matter the cost. He said her safety depended entirely on secrecy, and that even a single careless word could undo everything Margaret had died trying to protect. Did he ever explain what exactly her mother was protecting? Alastair asked. Mrs. Fenwick shook her head slowly. Only that it involved land and old grievances between families, and a wrong committed long before either of us were born that certain powerful men would go to great lengths to keep buried. I did not press him further. I trusted his judgment, and I loved that child as though she were my own. I believed I was protecting her, not imprisoning her, though I understand now how difficult it must have been to live the way she did. Alina reached across the small space between them and took Mrs. Fenwick's hand gently. "I do not blame you," she said. "You did what you believed was right, with the knowledge you had. I only wish now to finally live without that fear hanging over every choice I make." "Then let me help however I still can," Mrs. Fenwick said, her voice steadier now, resolve replacing years of quiet dread. "If speaking plainly of what I know will help secure your safety once and for all, I will not hide behind silence any longer, whatever the cost to myself." Alastair felt a measure of relief at her words, understanding how significant her willingness to testify openly could prove in the days ahead. But even as they discussed the details of how best to present their case, a servant hurried into the room, breathless, informing them that a formal carriage bearing the Ashworth crest had just been sighted approaching the estate, moving with unmistakable purpose along the main drive. Alastair rose immediately, moving to the window, and saw the carriage indeed drawing near, flanked by 2 mounted riders. Whatever confrontation lay ahead, it seemed Lord Callan Ashworth had grown tired of waiting, and had decided at last to face the matter directly, on the very grounds where the secret had been kept hidden for so many years. Alastair moved quickly, instructing Mrs. Fenwick to take Alina toward the rear of the house while he went to meet the carriage himself, hoping to prevent any direct confrontation between Alina and Lord Ashworth until he understood the man's intentions. But Alina refused to move, standing firm despite the fear visible in her eyes. "I have hidden from this family my entire life," she said. "I will not hide from them now, not while you stand beside me." There was no time to argue the point further. The carriage had already stopped before the main entrance, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped down from it with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to having every room bend to his presence. Lord Callan Ashworth wore his years with a kind of cold elegance, his expression carefully neutral as his gaze settled first on Alastair, and then, with unmistakable intensity, on Alina standing just behind him. "Your Grace," Lord Ashworth said, his voice smooth and unhurried, "I had hoped we might speak privately, but I see you have brought company." "This is my house," Alastair said evenly. "You will speak plainly and in the open, or you will not speak at all." Lord Ashworth's gaze lingered on Alina a moment longer before he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have passed for respect had it not carried such obvious calculation beneath it. "Very well. I believe you have recovered certain documents that do not belong to you, documents concerning land that has been rightfully held by my family for generations. I am prepared to discuss a fair resolution, one that would allow this matter to conclude quietly, without further disruption to anyone involved." "You mean without those documents ever seeing daylight?" Alastair said. "I mean," Lord Ashworth replied, his tone sharpening slightly, "that old disputes rarely benefit from being dragged into the present, especially when they concern matters long since settled by time, if not entirely by law. The young woman standing beside you has clearly grown into adulthood without incident. I see little reason to disturb that peace now with claims that predate her own birth." Alina stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her posture. "You call it peace, Lord Ashworth, but I have spent my entire life locked away, hidden from the world, because your family's grievance made my very existence dangerous. That is not peace. That is a life stolen from me, before I was old enough to understand why." For the first time, something flickered across Lord Ashworth's carefully composed expression, a brief crack in his confidence, quickly smoothed over. "You speak as though I bear personal responsibility for choices made before I inherited my title, Miss Hale. I assure you, I have simply sought to protect what rightfully belongs to my family, nothing more." "Protect it through fraud," Alastair said. "The confession we found, signed by a member of your own family, admits the original claim to that land was built upon a forged agreement. Whatever you have inherited, Lord Ashworth, was never rightfully yours to begin with." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Alastair began to wonder whether Lord Ashworth intended to abandon all pretense of civility entirely. Instead, the older man's shoulders settled, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, weary rather than commanding. "You believe recovering a single old document changes everything so simply," he said. "Perhaps it does in the eyes of the law. But consider carefully what such exposure would truly cost, not only my family, but every family whose fortunes have become entangled with ours through marriage, through business, through decades of alliances built upon the assumption that our standing was secure. You would not simply punish me, Your Grace. You would unravel a web far larger than you perhaps realize, and I promise you, not everyone caught within it will accept such unraveling quietly." "Is that a threat?" Alastair asked. "It is a warning," Lord Ashworth said, "offered in the hope that wiser heads might find a resolution that does not require such destruction. I am prepared to offer Miss Hale a fair settlement, land, or its equivalent value, along with a guarantee of safety and privacy for the remainder of her life, in exchange for the documents you have recovered, and her agreement never to pursue the matter further." "You want to buy her silence," Elinor said quietly. "The same way you tried to buy my mother's silence, all those years ago, before she refused, and paid for that refusal with a life spent in fear." Lord Ashworth's jaw tightened, but he said nothing to deny it. "I do not want your money," Elinor continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want the truth known. I want to live without fear that a locked door or a hidden room is the only thing standing between me and men like you. If that costs your family its fortune, then perhaps that fortune was never truly earned in the first place." Lord Ashworth studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted again, calculation giving way, briefly, to something that might almost have been respect, though it did nothing to soften his resolve. "Then I am afraid we have nothing further to discuss today," he said. "But understand, Miss Hale, that this matter will not end simply because you wish it to. I have resources and connections far beyond what either of you fully appreciate. I would advise you to consider carefully what you are choosing to set into motion." He turned without another word, climbing back into his carriage with the same unhurried composure with which he had arrived, though as the carriage pulled away down the long drive, Alastair caught a final glimpse of Lord Ashworth's face through the small window, no longer composed, but tight with barely restrained anger. "He will not simply let this go," Mrs. Fenwick said quietly, watching the carriage disappear around the bend. "I have seen that look before, though only once many years ago, before your father first arranged for Elinor to be hidden." "Then we move quickly," Alastair said. "Edward believes we need additional witnesses and independent verification before presenting the documents formally. We should return to town at once and begin arranging exactly that, before Lord Ashworth has time to prepare a response of his own." Elinor, though visibly shaken by the confrontation, nodded with quiet determination. "I am not afraid of him," she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the admission. "Not any more. I have spent too many years afraid. I would rather face whatever comes next than return to hiding." They departed Ravensworth Hall within the hour, Mrs. Fenwick agreeing to travel with them to town to provide her testimony formally before Edward Linwood and whatever authorities would eventually need to hear it. The journey back passed largely in tense silence, each of them aware that Lord Ashworth's warning had not been an empty one, and that whatever resources he possessed would likely be turned, swiftly and deliberately, toward preventing the truth from ever reaching a courtroom. That awareness proved well-founded. 2 nights after their return to town, Alastair woke to the sound of breaking glass in his study, followed by hurried footsteps and the unmistakable sound of drawers being pulled open in haste. He arrived just in time to see a shadowed figure fleeing through the broken window into the darkness of the garden beyond, and upon lighting a lamp, discovered that, while most of his father's papers remained undisturbed, the iron box containing the original deed and confession had been taken. He stood in the wreckage of his study, cold fury settling over him as he realized the true scope of what Lord Ashworth was prepared to do to protect his family's fortune, and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that the confrontation ahead would require far more than careful documents and quiet testimony. It would require a fight fought openly, before witnesses who could not be silenced, and a courage from Elinor that would test every bit of strength she had spent her whole life quietly building, hidden behind a locked door that, at last, could never be closed on her again. Edward Linwood arrived within the hour, summoned once again by an urgent message, and surveyed the damage to the study with a grim but curiously unsurprised expression. When Alastair explained that the iron box had been taken, Edward allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine sign of relief Alastair had seen from him in days. "I confess I anticipated something of this nature," Edward said. "After our first examination of the documents, I took the liberty of having certified copies made by a clerk I trust completely, along with a sworn statement confirming the authenticity of the originals at the time of copying. The thieves may have taken the iron box, Your Grace, but they have not taken the truth. It exists now in multiple hands, beyond Lord Ashworth's reach." Relief washed over Alastair, though it did little to soften his anger at the violation of his own home. "Then we proceed as planned." "More than that," Edward said. "I believe recent events have made our case considerably stronger. A break-in of this nature, so soon after a direct confrontation with Lord Ashworth at Ravensworth Hall, will not be difficult to connect, especially with witnesses present at both events. I intend to bring this matter before Lord Chief Justice Bramwell directly, requesting a formal hearing rather than a quiet court filing. If Lord Ashworth wishes to contest the documents, he will need to do so openly, before witnesses, rather than through further attempts at theft or intimidation." The hearing was arranged for the following week, held in a grand chamber within the halls of justice, before a panel of magistrates and a gathering of society's most prominent families, drawn by rumors that had already begun circulating despite everyone's careful efforts at discretion. Elinor stood beside Alastair as they entered the chamber, dressed simply but with quiet dignity, and though her hands trembled slightly, her chin remained lifted, her eyes steady. "Whatever happens today," Alastair said quietly as they took their seats, "you have already shown more courage than most people in this room will ever be asked to find in their entire lives." Lord Callan Ashworth arrived shortly after, accompanied by his own solicitor, a sharp-featured man who carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to winning difficult arguments. Lord Ashworth's expression remained composed, though Alastair noted a tightness around his eyes that suggested the confident facade required considerable effort to maintain. The proceedings opened with Edward presenting the certified copies of the deed and confession, along with a detailed account of their discovery at the Falcon Stone boundary marker. Lord Ashworth's solicitor immediately challenged the authenticity of the documents, suggesting they might easily have been forged for the purpose of extorting a wealthy and established family. "A reasonable concern," Edward acknowledged calmly, "which is precisely why we have brought additional witnesses today, whose testimony does not rely upon the documents alone." Mrs. Fenwick was called first, and though her voice shook at the beginning of her testimony, it steadied as she spoke, describing in careful detail the late Duke's insistence upon secrecy, his repeated warnings about the Ashworth family's determination to recover what he described as dangerous proof of an old wrong, and the genuine fear that had governed the household for over 15 years. The magistrates listened closely, several exchanging glances as her account unfolded. Next came Dr. Halloway, the physician who had visited Elinor twice yearly at Ravensworth Hall, who confirmed the unusual and deliberate secrecy surrounding his visits. the instructions never to record Alina's presence in any official capacity, and the late Duke's private admission to him, made during a moment of evident distress, that he feared for the girl's safety, should certain powerful families learn of documents proving old fraud connected to disputed land. Lord Ashworth's solicitor pressed each witness carefully, searching for inconsistencies, but found the accounts remarkably consistent, each independently corroborating details the witnesses could not plausibly have coordinated in advance. When it came time for Alina herself to speak, the chamber fell into an unusually attentive silence, drawn by curiosity toward the young woman whose entire existence had, until recently, remained a carefully guarded secret. "I do not come before you today seeking wealth, or revenge, or even an apology," Alina said, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet steadiness. "I come only asking that the truth finally be allowed to stand in the open, so that I might live the remainder of my life without fear that a door will need to be locked again to keep me safe. My mother died believing that truth would one day set me free. I ask this chamber only to honor that belief." A murmur passed through the gathered crowd, and Alastair saw, even among families who had long maintained cordial relations with the Ashworths, expressions of genuine sympathy forming on more than a few faces. Lord Ashworth's solicitor rose to offer a final challenge, questioning whether Alina's account, however moving, could truly be considered reliable evidence given her admitted lack of clear childhood memory regarding the events in question. It was then that Alastair rose, producing the final piece of evidence he had held in reserve, the ring recovered alongside the documents at the Falcon Stone. He presented it to the magistrates, explaining its discovery and the falcon crest engraved upon its band, matching precisely the seal found on the original fraudulent agreement decades earlier. "This ring," Alastair said, "was entrusted to Margaret Hale by her own family before the dispute began. A family record confirms as much, held by the local parish registry, listing the ring as part of a dowry promised alongside the very land now in question. It is not simply a piece of jewelry, but a physical link connecting Margaret Hale's family directly to rightful ownership of that parcel. Ownership stolen through the forged agreement. My father's letters, Mrs. Fenwick's testimony, and Dr. Halloway's account all independently confirm was known and feared by everyone involved." The chief magistrate studied the ring carefully, comparing it against the seal on the confession, before setting it down and addressing the chamber with grave formality. "Given the weight and consistency of the evidence presented today, this court finds sufficient grounds to order a full and formal investigation into the original land transaction between the Hale and Ashworth families, with all relevant holdings placed under judicial review pending the outcome. Lord Ashworth, you and your solicitors will be expected to cooperate fully with this investigation, or face considerably more serious consequences than the return of disputed land." Lord Ashworth's composure finally broke, if only slightly, his face paling as the full weight of the ruling settled over him. He said nothing further, rising stiffly and departing the chamber with his solicitor close behind, the confident bearing that had carried him through the proceedings noticeably absent from his final, hurried steps toward the door. As the chamber slowly emptied, Alina turned to Alastair, tears finally slipping free after what had clearly been an enormous effort to hold them back throughout the proceedings. "It is truly happening," she said softly. "After everything, it is truly happening." "It is," Alastair said, taking her hand gently in his own. "And whatever comes next, land returned or fortunes reassessed, the most important truth has already been secured today. You are free, Alina, truly fully free for the first time in your life." Mrs. Fenwick approached them both, her own eyes damp with tears of relief. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said to Alina, "for the courage you found today. I only wish she could have lived to see it." "Perhaps in some way she has," Alina said softly, looking down at the ring Alastair still held carefully in his palm. "Her patience, her love, all of it led exactly here to this moment. I do not think that courage disappears simply because a person is no longer living. I believe it waits quietly until it is needed again." Outside the halls of justice, A light rain had begun to fall, gentle and unhurried, nothing like the storm that had first brought Alistair back to Ravensworth Hall so many weeks before. As they stepped out into the cool evening air together, Alistair felt, for the first time since this entire journey began, a genuine sense that the danger surrounding Alinar had finally begun to recede, leaving behind not an ending, but the quiet, hopeful beginning of an entirely new chapter. The weeks that followed the hearing brought changes neither Alistair nor Alinar could have fully anticipated. The judicial investigation into the Ashworth family's holdings moved forward with a thoroughness that left little room for delay or evasion. And within a month, the disputed parcel of land surrounding the Falcon Stone was formally returned to Alinar as Margaret Hale's sole surviving heir, along with a substantial settlement drawn from Ashworth family funds to account for decades of unlawful possession. Lord Callan Ashworth, stripped of both fortune and much of his standing within society, retreated from public life almost entirely, his name mentioned afterward only in quiet, careful whispers rather than the confident tones he had once commanded. Alinar, for her part, found herself navigating a world entirely unfamiliar to her, one filled with formal invitations, curious glances from society's most prominent families, and a newfound freedom that still, at times, felt almost unreal after a lifetime spent behind locked doors. She handled it all with a quiet grace that surprised everyone who had expected the hidden girl from Ravensworth Hall to arrive in society awkward or overwhelmed. Instead, she moved through each new experience with the same careful, thoughtful attention she had once given to the pages of books that had been her only window to the wider world for so many years. Alistair found himself, more often than not, at her side through each of these new experiences, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wished to be there to see her discover simple pleasures he had long taken for granted. Her first visit to a public garden without fear of being seen, her first evening at the theater, watching a performance with wide, delighted eyes, her first slow walk along the riverbank at sunset, marveling at the way the light shifted across the water. "I used to imagine what it might be like," Alinar told him one evening, as they walked together through the quiet garden behind his townhouse, the setting sun casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges. "Freedom, I mean. I imagined it as something enormous and overwhelming, too large to ever truly hold. But it is simpler than that, is it not? It is walks like this, ordinary moments finally lived without fear." "I am glad you have found it," Alistair said, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of what might come next, now that the danger surrounding her had passed, and the reason that had first bound their lives together no longer held the same urgency. Alinar seemed to sense the shift in his mood, stopping beneath the shade of an old oak tree to study him carefully. "You seem troubled," she said, "now that everything has been resolved." "I have grown accustomed to your presence," Alistair admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the confession. "More than accustomed, if I am truthful. I find myself wondering what shape my days will take, now that you are free to choose any path you wish, without needing my protection any longer." Alinar's expression softened, and she reached for his hand, an easy, natural gesture that would have been unthinkable for someone so recently freed from a lifetime of careful restraint, yet felt, in this moment, entirely right. "I do not wish for my path to lead away from you," she said quietly. "I have thought of little else these past weeks, though I confess I did not know how to say it plainly. You gave me my freedom, Alistair, but more than that, you gave me the courage to believe I deserved it in the first place. I do not know what that feeling is called exactly, but I know I do not wish to walk away from it." Alistair felt something in his chest loosen entirely, a hope he had not fully allowed himself to acknowledge until this very moment. "I believe I know what it is called," he said softly, "though I confess it feels far too large a word for such a quiet evening as this." "Say it anyway," Alinar said, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. "Love," Alistair said simply. "I love you, Alinar. Not out of duty, or obligation, or the strange circumstances that first brought us together, but simply because of who you are, the courage you carried through years of hidden silence, and the grace with which you have stepped into a world that owed you so much more than it ever gave." Alina's eyes filled with tears, though her smile remained steady. "I love you as well," she said. "I did not expect to find such a feeling waiting for me on the other side of that locked door, but I am endlessly grateful that I did." They stood together beneath the old oak tree as the last light of evening faded into a soft, gentle dusk, and for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, the future ahead felt entirely open, unburdened by hidden rooms or waiting dangers, filled instead with the simple, quiet promise of a life finally lived in the open. In the months that followed, Alistair formally requested Alina's hand, a proposal offered not in some grand, public gesture, but quietly, beneath the same oak tree where they had first spoken of love, surrounded only by the garden they had both come to cherish. Alina accepted without hesitation, and their wedding, held the following spring, drew a gathering far larger than either of them had anticipated. Society's curiosity about the once hidden young woman transformed, over the months since the hearing, into genuine admiration for the quiet strength she had shown throughout her long ordeal. Mrs. Fenwick attended, seated proudly near the front, alongside Dr. Halloway and Edward Linwood, each of whom had played a crucial role in finally bringing Alina's story into the light. Charlotte stood beside Alina as she walked toward Alistair, her sharp humor softened, for once, into quiet, genuine emotion as she watched her cousin's long search for happiness finally reach its conclusion. As Alistair took Alina's hands before the gathered crowd, he found himself thinking back to that stormy night so many months ago, the narrow, hidden door at the end of Ravensworth Hall's east corridor, and the frightened but resilient young woman who had stood behind it, uncertain whether the world beyond was safe enough to finally step into. He thought of the declaration he had made that night, impulsive and certain all at once, taking her home, though neither of them had fully understood then just how far that simple promise would eventually carry them both. "I once told you I was taking you home," Alistair said quietly, meant only for her ears amid the soft murmur of the gathered crowd. "I did not fully understand that night that home was never simply a place. It was always meant to be this, wherever you are, however far we must travel to find it together." Alina's answering smile carried within it every quiet year of hidden hope she had once carried alone, now finally fully realized. "Then let us build that home together," she said, openly and without fear, "for as long as we both shall live." And so they did, beginning that very day, a life built not upon secrecy or fear, but upon the hard-won truth that had finally set them both free, a truth that, once spoken aloud, could never again be locked behind any door. 5 years passed, and the quiet corridors of Ravensworth Hall, once filled with silence and locked doors, rang instead with the sound of laughter, the running footsteps of 2 small children chasing one another through hallways their mother had once been forbidden even to walk freely. Alina had insisted, early in their marriage, that the narrow hidden room at the end of the east corridor be transformed entirely, its walls repainted in warm, bright colors, its narrow bed replaced with shelves upon shelves of books and toys, until it became not a place of confinement, but a favorite reading nook for their eldest daughter, who loved nothing more than curling into the window seat with a storybook while sunlight poured freely through curtains that were never, under any circumstance, to be drawn closed. Mrs. Fenwick remained at the hall, her role shifting gently from housekeeper bound by fearful secrecy into a beloved figure the children called Aunt Fenwick, her once careful, guarded manner softened over the years into open warmth, though she never quite lost the habit of glancing instinctively toward the windows whenever a carriage approached unexpectedly, an old caution that time alone could not fully erase, even after danger had long since passed. Lord Callan Ashworth was rarely spoken of after those difficult months, though word occasionally reached them of a quieter, humbler life he had built for himself in a distant county, stripped of the wealth and influence that had once defined him. Yet, according to Edward Linwood's occasional updates, seemingly at peace with a simpler existence far removed from the ambitions that had once driven him toward such desperate action. Whether that peace came from genuine reflection or simple exhaustion, None of them could say for certain, nor did they spend much time wondering. The past, at last, had been allowed to settle quietly into memory, no longer casting a shadow over the present. Charlotte visited often, her sharp wit undiminished by the passing years, delighting endlessly in spoiling her young cousins with treats and stories of her own adventures, while Dr. Halloway, long retired from formal practice, took particular pride in having played a small but crucial part in a story he liked to describe, with a fond, knowing smile, as the finest case of his entire career, one measured not in medicine, but in justice finally served. Alina herself grew into her role not simply as Duchess, but as a quiet advocate for others whose stories had gone unheard, using both her title and the considerable resources it afforded to establish a small but steadily growing foundation dedicated to assisting families entangled in old land disputes and inheritance fraud, determined that no other child should ever again spend a childhood locked away out of fear, as she once had. It became, over time, a cause she pursued with the same quiet determination that had first carried her out of that narrow, hidden room and into a life she had once believed impossible to reach. On quiet evenings, when the children had finally been coaxed to sleep, and the great house settled into its familiar, comfortable silence, Alastair and Alina often found themselves walking together through the same garden where he had first confessed his love beneath the old oak tree, its branches grown fuller now, offering wider shade with each passing year, much like the life they had built together beneath it. "Do you ever think of that night?" Alina asked him once, as they walked slowly along the familiar path. "The storm, the locked door, the way everything changed so suddenly." "Often," Alastair admitted. "I think of how close I came to never returning to the hall at all, had that letter from Edward never arrived. I think of how many years might have passed with you still hidden behind that door, waiting for a rescue that might never have come." "But it did come," Alina said softly, slipping her hand into his. "And everything that followed, every difficult moment, every danger we faced together, led us exactly here to this life, this home, these children who will never know the fear I once carried simply for existing." "That is the truest victory of all," Alastair said, drawing her closer as the evening light softened around them. "Not simply that the danger passed, but that it left nothing behind except the life we chose to build in its place." Alina rested her head against his shoulder, watching as their eldest daughter's window glowed warmly in the distance, curtains open wide to the evening sky, exactly as she had always insisted they should be. "Then let us keep building it," she said quietly, openly and without fear, "for as long as we both shall live, and long after in the lives of everyone who comes after us." And in the years that followed, that is precisely what they did, their home remaining always open, always full of light, a place where no door was ever locked against the world again, and where the quiet courage of one hidden girl, once believed lost to silence and shadow, became instead the foundation upon which an entire family's future was so lovingly and so bravely built.